we're talking about weight loss through the functional medicine lens. I'm going to give you 4 of the functional imbalances that are most often involved in overweight and obesity. Because if we don't address the 4 root causes at their roots, then sustainable weight loss virtually becomes impossible. Welcome to Functional Medicine for Real World Impact, where we're diving into the complex, interconnected nature of health and disease, exploring not just theory, but practically what it takes to turn functional medicine insight into powerful, practical, real-world results. So please hit subscribe and let's get started. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you the 4 common imbalances that are most often involved through the functional medicine lens. And one of the most important principles that I want to start off with today is that a state of overweight or a state of obesity is actually a natural reflection, a natural manifestation of imbalance in the body. And certainly the popular medical and health media tends to focus on too much calories, too much food, too much sugar, too much baked goods. And certainly those behaviors can indeed be counterproductive and part of the behavioral environment that's promoting overweight. But I think one of the most valuable things that we can do for patients and clients who approach us looking for weight loss, because it's such a common singular request, right, for people who seek out your support clinically. In fact, in our practitioner community at SAFM, we're often amazed at how individuals can present with dozens of debilitating symptoms. They have chronic migraines. They have tremendous GI dysfunction and bloating. They may have debilitating joint pain or asthma or diarrhea. So many different challenges. And yet the number one thing they're focused on is they want weight loss, and they want it more so than resolving the other dysfunction and symptoms that they are wrestling with. And it can be really powerful to teach individuals that the body will naturally pack on more weight, specifically more adiposity, more fat, as a natural response to several different functional imbalances. And it's critical to teach people that this is not happening, of course, because their body is against them or weak or has some kind of negative intent, or is just not responding to their desires. Of course not. The body's perspective on fat is that it helps to promote survival. Increased adiposity is metabolic insurance against challenge or starvation or death in uncertain times. And this speaks to the very strong connection between stress and weight gain. And today we're going to be talking in one of the 4 root causes about some of the more insidious and often hidden sources of stress. So please stay with me today for all 4 functional imbalances, and especially the last one because it's the most important one and is often overlooked. But let's dive in. Because insulin resistance is certainly the most common driver for overweight and obesity in the patients and clients that you serve. It has become ubiquitous, and we often miss insulin resistance prior to a formal diagnosis of prediabetes or even entrenched type 2 diabetes because we're not looking for it in its earlier stages. Often we are waiting until what we term the 3rd stage, the 3rd of 4 stages of metabolic dysfunction before we even acknowledge that there's an imbalance, much less respond clinically. And research shows that individuals can be in the earlier stages of metabolic dysfunction for 3, 5, 7, 10, 13 or more years when they don't know that there is an opportunity to change their lives and therefore change their biochemistry and reverse this metabolic dysfunction that can not only eventually promote cardiovascular disease and all sorts of other disability, but can also promote the overweight and obesity that so many people are looking to avoid. And in particular, I want to encourage all of us to begin to acknowledge that early on, way before there is pancreatic insufficiency, before the pancreas is not putting out enough insulin to accommodate the glycemic load of a person's lifestyle. And this is where we start to see blood sugar progressively rise and becoming more and more of a challenge for so many tissues because of the oxidative stress and damage that is promoted by elevated blood sugar. Yes, that is stage 3 and can progress to stage 4. But many years prior to blood sugar rising, we actually see a long period of time in which blood sugar can be truly optimal. An individual is moving along, they're living their lives, and we're only looking at typically fasting glucose. And fasting glucose can certainly look normal, and even if we're looking at it in a tighter functional reference range for assessment, we might say their blood sugar is optimal. But behind the scenes, the progressive increase in glycemic load is promoting the body to become accommodating. And in particular, the pancreas, in its deep adaptive capacity, is often beginning to put out higher and higher levels of insulin in response to our glycemic load. And it's important to remember that glycemic load is a combination of our diet and then also the body's own innate synthesis of sugar, which is in particular in response to stress hormones. And this means that individuals can have a high glycemic load because of the food and beverages that they take in, high refined carbohydrates, added sugars, excessive carbohydrates, excessive calories, period. We all are aware of these types of standard American dietary dynamics. But sometimes people's diets are fairly optimal. And instead, what we're seeing is stress being a major contributor to increased glycemic load because of gluconeogenesis and stress hormones promoting the body's own innate synthesis of blood sugar. But during this adaptive time, which may be many years, it may be decades, the pancreas is adapting to this increased glycemic load and is putting out greater and greater levels of insulin in response to our blood sugar levels. And individuals may see themselves start to experience episodic hypoglycemia, where their blood sugar is maybe not precipitously dropping at this point, but they definitely experience some blood sugar lows. They may find that eating more frequently makes them feel a little more comfortable. They may start to notice that they become a little squishier. People talk about maybe losing some of their muscle mass, picking up more belly fat. They are noticing a bit more fat or loss of lean muscle mass, in particular in the large muscles of the legs, because of the size of these muscles. And they are otherwise just a tremendous resource for glucose disposal. We spend a lot of time sitting around on our bums in front of computers these days in offices and at desks. And we are not disposing of this glycemic load that our lifestyles are creating. And this in general is creating this strong impetus for the pancreas to put out higher levels of insulin. First of all, in response to a high load, maybe a notable meal or a notable period of stress. But over time, the body will develop subclinical hyperinsulinemia. This is where glycemic load has been high enough that the pancreas is anticipating a high glycemic load. And first morning fasting insulin or fasting C-peptide, which is a more durable marker that has a longer half-life in the body, these are going to start to be subclinically elevated. And it is a great reminder. The functional medicine lens teaches us that there's a lot of disease, a lot of dysfunction inside typical lab reference ranges, because lab ranges are, for the most part, are not optimal ranges or target zones. They are a simple reflection of two standard deviations around a normal value. It's showing you what the population actually has. And when an imbalance or a diagnosis is nearly epidemic in a society, then there's going to be a lot of disease inside normal reference ranges. And we can't ignore values that fall within those ranges. We want to be looking for optimal zones. And for example, research shows that a fasting insulin elevation in, say, the upper 2/3 of the normal range is likely indicative of some degree of insulin resistance. And this adaptive increase in insulin to accommodate glycemic load can continue for many years or even decades. Now, as fasting insulin trends higher and higher and higher, patients are going to start to have daily hypoglycemia. And in fact, not so much their fasting glucose, because that's driven quite a bit by cortisol levels, and especially a strong cortisol awakening response in the morning. But you'll start to see individuals' hemoglobin A1C values perhaps going a bit lower. Their average glucose is actually trending downward, not upward. And again, this can continue for years, long before the pancreas starts to become unable to adapt to the glucose load. And so individuals will complain of hypoglycemia. Their adiposity is continuing to increase, and they will struggle with focus and concentration. They will be hungry and maybe not able to think clearly, have brain fog, have trouble walking or coordination, or have strong emotional lability and mood imbalances, maybe headaches, as a result of these hypoglycemic episodes. But if all we're looking at is hemoglobin A1C or fasting glucose, we think it looks fine. Or even sometimes people will be complimented. Oh my gosh, you eat a standard American diet, but your hemoglobin A1C is 4.9%. It should make you stop in your tracks and think, wait a minute, this is not logical. We don't want to ignore seemingly optimal lab markers when they don't make sense in the context of who is this person. And we can't find an imbalance that we don't look for. And so fasting insulin or fasting C-peptide would be a wonderful addition to an annual physical lab panel for the vast, vast majority of your patients and clients, so that we can see where this phase 1 and phase 2 progressive hyperinsulinemia is brewing. Again, maybe many, many years before pancreatic insufficiency develops. Blood sugar stabilizes for a time at more moderate levels and then will eventually start to increase. So we want to be looking for these markers, because otherwise in the intervening years or decades, your patients are being told what by their primary care provider? They're being told they're fine. You're fine. Great job. This looks great. No issues here. Keep doing what you're doing. High five. See you next year. And this, for me, is a travesty, because your patients and clients who may be very open to, very interested in learning about the state of their health in a proactive vein and being able to take proactive action to change their lives, to modify their behaviors, to avert a diagnosis, avert an imbalance, avert further adiposity and obesity, but they can't respond to messages they aren't being given. So we need to be looking for metabolic dysfunction way earlier than is typically done today. Now, of course, otherwise, we keep doing the same behaviors and metabolic progression proceeds, and we end up developing pancreatic insufficiency. And this can happen for a number of reasons. Well, we blame the pancreas, but while we have hyperinsulinemia, we know that insulin triggers fat uptake throughout the body. The overload of sugars promotes the liver to convert a lot of that sugar into triglycerides, which gets stored in the liver itself for that fatty infiltration and the early stages of fatty liver. But those triglycerides are also being exported for distribution throughout the body. And we start to lose some of that lean muscle mass and pick up additional adiposity. But the liver, of course, is not the only organ or gland that becomes fatty. And you can easily develop the early stages of fatty pancreas. And just like creating hepatic dysfunction for the liver, we can end up with metabolic dysfunction or insufficiency because of this fatty infiltration in the pancreas, especially in the early stages. It's also true that elevated blood sugar can be promoting oxidative damage and vascular challenges in organs and glands. We know that the 4 tissues that often have the earliest dysfunction because of that progressive blood sugar load are the eyes, the kidneys, the lining of our arteries and also our nerves, right? Hence the nephropathy and the neuropathy, for example, that are so commonly associated with diabetes. But the pancreas itself can become dysfunctional. We know that autoimmune dynamics can also develop that cause pancreatic dysfunction. But the pancreas needs some attention as we move into this phase. But what we often don't think about in progressive insulin resistance is the gut. And it's only courtesy of the celebrity status of GLP-1 agonist drugs that most practitioners are even thinking about the role of the gut as it relates to metabolic dysfunction. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, it makes perfect sense that metabolic function and the gut would be intimately connected because this is predominantly where we're getting our fuel to promote our metabolism, our cellular metabolism and energy and survival. And so, of course, our motility to promote macronutrient uptake should indeed logically be regulated in part by blood sugar and metabolic status. And most of you, I'm sure, are very well aware now that normally GLP-1 and other incretins, which are gastrointestinal hormones, are secreted in the upper GI tract, in particular in response to gastric emptying, in order to help trigger first phase insulin response. This means we need good GI motility in order to have well-regulated metabolic response. If we have accelerated gastric emptying, then that aggressive movement of the chyme out of the stomach into the duodenum is going to pop a stronger response from incretins, and we're going to get more insulin release. If we have impaired motility, dysmotility, and sluggish movements in the upper GI tract or delayed gastric emptying, then we're going to be more likely to have a slow or sluggish incretin response and a more modest insulin release from the pancreas. And GLP-1 agonist medications are designed to work with this natural flow of signaling hormones. But of course, the constant use of them, irrespective of what the blood sugar is ultimately interfering with the body's natural regulatory response. And this is why once people start taking these medications, they are dependent on them. And especially if they're taking them at the typical much higher dose, it also gives people the false belief that they don't have to change anything about their life, that there is indeed a magic pill that will just allow them to eat any type of foods, including all sorts of high glycemic junk food, and lose weight. It is the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for a lot of people, but I'm sure it resonates with you as well that in doing this type of intervention, we are ultimately providing a tremendous disservice for the majority of our patients. And this is because anytime we support people's belief that they don't have to modify the very behaviors that promoted imbalance and disease in the first place, they don't have to change any of that in order to get relief. We are removing their responsibility for their own health. That is not a service. We're removing their accountability and on top of that, their empowerment to make a difference in their own life, to make a difference in their future health, the prognosis of these imbalances. And so pharmaceuticals can be really wonderful blessings and highly appropriate interventions in the context of functional medicine. But when we use them at a large dose or for an extended duration, that gives the patient the perception that they don't need to do anything. They just need to take a pill and they'll get 100% pain relief. They will get full alleviation of the blockage or the impairment or the cramping or the tension or the obesity. We are not ultimately serving them because, of course, the minute they come off of the medication, the innate imbalance that's been there all along behind the scenes is going to come rushing back. It's also true even if people continue to take the medication for an extended period of time. A fascinating reality through the functional medicine lens is that medications can often drive secondary and tertiary imbalances that end up exacerbating or promoting recurrence of the very disease dynamic that they were prescribed to resolve in the first place. For GLP-1 agonists, one of the biggest challenges for this is, of course, with the liver gallbladder axis, because anytime you're purposefully impairing GI motility, we're going to be setting off secondary disease dynamics, and especially upper GI motility in directly affecting or slowing gastric emptying in order to promote greater satiety. So people have lesser appetite and they eat less, and this promotes weight loss. We are also slowing the emptying of the gallbladder. We are slowing the movement of bile through the hepatic biliary tree. And research has made very clear that over time, this increases the risk of biliary congestion, the formation of gallstones, eventual blockage, gallbladder disease, and cholecystectomy. And so, given that fatty liver and in hepatic biliary congestion and gallbladder challenges are so often part of the puzzle pieces of the picture of metabolic disease, it's a fascinating way to come back around full circle and have fatty liver and hepatic biliary issues for a completely different set of reasons because of long-term medication use to try and counter that obesity that was at the roots of the liver problem in the first place. And so we want to be looking for early stages of hepatic biliary congestion and addressing it at its roots before we start using GLP-1 agonist drugs. I also implore you to consider using lower doses of these medications that actually require that people also make dietary lifestyle change, that they really understand the role of various stressors in their lives in promoting high glycemic load, that they understand the criticality of movement in order to promote glucose disposal. Yes, the drugs can be a strong support and a wonderful part of a collection of functional interventions. But when the dose is so high that personal responsibility is abdicated, we're not providing a service for those individuals that we're supporting in our practice. So we could talk so much more about insulin resistance, but the gut has got to be healthy to have optimal insulin signaling. Incretins are just the beginning because as chyme flows through the duodenum and down into the jejunum and then the ileum, in the small intestines, we have a family of brush border enzymes called the class of DPP4 enzymes. And these have a digestive function to help us pull nutrients from our foods, and anything that we are putting into our GI tract that is promoting mucosal degradation. And this can be anything from birth control pills and NSAIDs like ibuprofen to steroid medications, oral estrogen containing drugs like birth control pills, but also things like suboptimal vitamin D or suboptimal zinc, or the toxic chemicals that come into our body via our food, things like glyphosate that is sprayed on so many crops that are conventionally raised, at least here in the United States. Toxicity can also be promoting mucosal damage. Or we take antibiotics at the drop of a hat these days. And while we may cause short-term relief, antibiotics can promote opportunistic overgrowths in bacterial species, fungal species, and yeast, or creating antibiotic resistance and then immune reactivity to a dysbiosis or a microbial imbalance in the gut creates oxidative wear and tear on that mucosa. The point being, so many things can promote mucosal degradation in the gut, which starts to impair the synthesis of these brush border enzymes. So suddenly we are lactose intolerant. Suddenly we have histamine overload. Suddenly we may be gluten intolerant, but also we may be progressively contributing to hyperinsulinemia because DPP4 enzymes produced in the brush border of the gut are helping to regulate second phase insulin response. And in fact, DPP4 enzymes provide a constraining brake against the more aggressive first phase insulin response due to incretins. So we need healthy mucosa. We need a healthy gut lining in order to provide optimal insulin regulation. So we'll do another whole video on that topic alone, but I want to leave insulin resistance because we need to be exploring it more richly, but it's only one of the 4 drivers, most common functional imbalances at the root of overweight and obesity. What's number 2? I choose hypothyroidism, especially for women. Subclinical hypothyroidism in particular is rampant. In our practitioner forums at SAFM, we are constantly seeing case after case after case where women have obvious presentation. They're complaining openly and asking for help with classic hypothyroidism symptoms. They frequently feel cold, and not just in their extremities, but in their whole body, especially in their buttocks. They struggle with low energy and malaise. They're open to exercise and movement, but they're just too tired. They are constipated and bloated. They have dysmotility, or they have frequent dyspepsia. They just have a general sense of poor digestion. They are struggling with hair loss, in particular on the top of their head, and not a pattern type of loss that may speak to other hormonal imbalances, but just a general shedding of hair on their head. They may struggle with infertility. They may have a number of IBS type of symptoms. They may be progressively gaining weight, even though they're eating a better and better diet and they don't know why. And in particular, they're struggling with mood imbalance. This may tend toward more hypervigilance and anxiety, or it may tend toward malaise and depression. These women are very often dismissed by conventional medicine, or even worse, they're prescribed an anxiolytic or an antidepressant medication, in part because the only thing we're looking at, even if we're evaluating thyroid function, and often it isn't evaluated at all, even an annual physical, but the most commonly, we're only looking at thyroid stimulating hormone, or only TSH. And we need to collectively start busting the myth that if TSH it has a normal value, then we don't need to measure anything else because thyroid function in that person is fine. And that is not true. That is a long-held myth. But we have seen, I personally have evaluated at this point hundreds of different lab panels where TSH is not only normal, but it might be what many of you consider to be optimal. Right? The total T4 or even free T4 is mid-normal, or even in the upper half or the upper third of the normal range. And you're also checking T3 thyroid hormone, which is the one that is actually very active intracellularly and actually engaging with nuclear receptors in order to affect basal metabolic rate. But people can have optimal TSH and clinically low T4. We see this all the time. They can have optimal TSH and clinically low total T3 or free T3. This is not uncommon. But if we're not looking for a full thyroid panel, once again, you can't find what you don't look for. And subclinical hypothyroidism, I think, is in near epidemic status in women, in particular, preferentially in women. And a full thyroid panel also needs to include looking at not just one of the 2 classic autoimmune antibodies, but both of them, thyroid peroxidase and also thyroglobulin autoantibodies. It's quite common for people to have a marked elevation in only one of those 2. It's another common myth. If you have one, you must have the other. And if one is below the clinical threshold of significance, then we don't really need to worry about the other one. That is also not true, and we see clinical evidence of that all the time. And also in the context of strong clinical presentation, qualitatively. But a full thyroid panel for women, at least every few years, I think is really prudent, but especially if they are presenting with some of the classic sequelae of hypothyroidism, even if it's mild, we should be checking for hypothyroidism, because it is incredibly common, and that may be at the roots of your female patient's infertility. It might be at the roots of their insulin resistance, right? Because we just talked about how much the gut regulates insulin function. And hypothyroidism will cause sluggishness in the entire GI tract, impaired secretion of digestive substances, impaired motility, not just in the form of constipation, but throughout the entire GI tract. We may have impaired restoration of mucosa, just like we have impaired wound healing on the skin or in a variety of tissues as a result of hypothyroidism. So we need to be thinking about this subclinical dynamic being at the roots of a variety of other symptoms and challenges, in particular for the women you support. And the most common marker we're not looking at is T3. Thyroid hormone. Once again, there's lots of myths that T4 is what the thyroid is predominantly putting out. And if there's enough of that, the body will necessarily make enough T3 thyroid hormone. And indeed, the body has several different overlapping synergistic pathways for supporting that. Oh, the thyroid itself, by the way, also makes a substantial amount of T3, not only for its own purposes, but also putting out into systemic circulation. And all of the cells in the body that need thyroid hormone for controlling that basal metabolic rate, whether it's a brain cell or a liver cell or a left quadriceps, a muscle cell, all of these cells and tissues have the ability to regulate their own metabolic needs. And throughout the body at any given time, some tissues might be having a more accelerated metabolic status on purpose, maybe again to heal some type of damage. And other ones might be having a more sluggish metabolic state, again, on purpose, perhaps because of some type of a threat. This is normal. And so anytime we're looking at a lab marker and thinking that the feedback from the brain, especially in the form of TSH, is representative of the health and sufficiency throughout the whole body is an oversimplification. It's a misnomer. Research shows clearly that the brain may be deeply satisfied with its amount of thyroid hormone, but the liver isn't, the heart isn't, that left quadriceps isn't. And so we want to pay attention to the whole presentation and also be looking for these other markers that are really the best we can do to understand what is happening intracellularly. And the body can promote in progressive disease states a hypometabolic state on purpose, and really trying to understand where that has become chronic and a disease dynamic in its own right, and addressing the root causes of it can bring tremendous relief to your patients and clients. But suboptimal levels of T3 thyroid hormone can happen for a variety of reasons. First of all, the tissue that is carrying out a lot of this biochemical conversion from T4 to T3, whether it's the liver or the kidneys or the gut lining or the thyroid itself, we can struggle with that simply because of inadequate nutrients. We need key cofactor nutrients like zinc and iron and selenium in order to support this biochemistry. We also need sufficient levels of cortisol, for example, to optimally prime nuclear receptors for T3 thyroid hormone. It is not true that that the nuclear receptors have high affinity for T4 thyroid hormone. We can convert T4 to T3 intracellularly inside the cell and therefore not measured in the blood. If indeed the cell has enough nutrition to make those conversions readily, and if indeed the appropriate priming of receptors can occur in the body. And cortisol levels are a major driver for that. Cortisol levels can be too high or too low. But we also want to be paying attention to autoimmune dynamics, because even when there's a subclinical elevation in thyroid autoimmune antibodies, we want to be turning our attention to the immune system, because whether someone has Hashimoto's thyroiditis or multiple sclerosis or lupus or rheumatoid arthritis, all of the different many autoimmune disease dynamics that we recognize today, and there's way more than 100 of them, while they may affect different body parts, they claim different tissues, if you will, as victims, they all at their roots have immune dysregulation and hypervigilance as a physiological root cause. And so much of appropriate immune priming and regulation begins in the gut. We come back to the gut yet again. If you want to resolve hypothyroidism at its roots, especially if it has an autoimmune driver, you really want to master the gut through the functional medicine lens, because a dysbiosis in the gut can be promoting chronic immune hypervigilance. That mucosal degradation can be promoting loss of barrier function in the intestinal lining and allowing a lot of those inflammatory mediators that are normally harbored in the gut to actually be released into systemic circulation. A major driver for autoimmune disease systemically is cross-reactive immune hypervigilance against the tissue, because it looks molecularly a little too much like a known threat. And this can be in reaction to a virus, it can be in reaction to a bacteria, it can be in reaction to a food, like gluten, for example. Any of these can cause this cross-reactive or molecular mimicry pattern that causes the immune system to attack part of self in a chronic dynamic, not because the immune system is unintelligent or, again, against us or weak or ill-informed. None of those things are true. And I don't think any of that language is helpful in a clinical context, because it can promote a lack of confidence in your patients. Questioning, is my body against me? Is my body strong? Is my body really intelligent? And can I count on it to keep me safe and responsive? We want to use language that really educates what is at play. And indeed, states of maldigestion, dysmotility, mucosal degradation, loss of barrier function or enhanced intestinal permeability, dysbiosis or imbalance in the microbiome. All of these are examples of functional gut imbalances that are often at the roots of autoimmune diseases. And so these are just some examples and some clinical tips that you want to think about and look for in the context of hypothyroidism. Because when you have a hypothyroid dynamic, not episodically, that's perfectly normal, especially when we're healing from trauma or an injury or a surgery. But long term, this is a major driver for obesity, because we are dropping our basal metabolic rate that's being actually directly regulated by those thyroid hormones. And this means we are not making optimal use of that glycemic load in terms of being turned into energy that we can actually use to fuel our activities. So we've covered number one, we've covered number two. What about number three? What would you choose? What functional imbalance do you think is often at the roots of overweight and obesity? Next, I want to talk about estrogen, because the imbalance of what we often call estrogen dominance can promote overweight and obesity. And I want to say a quick word here about terms. Estrogen dominance, sometimes practitioners take this term to mean that estrogen is somehow a negative thing and we need to work on reducing estrogen. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Estrogen is life-giving. Without the gift of estrogen, we could not reproduce as humans. And indeed, there are many menopausal women in our community who would be quick to defend the importance of estrogen for things such as hydration in the body. And then as estrogen levels wane, we can end up with dry lips, dry skin, dry mucous membranes, dry vagina. We can end up with brain fog and cognitive impairment, and also plays key roles in promoting insulin sensitivity to help with the very first reason that I gave. But we, like anything else in the body, right? Whether it's calcium or vitamin D, or cholesterol, or inflammation. All of these critically important and valuable biochemicals can become disease promoting when we have too much of them. And I think the most insidious dynamic at play in our patients' lives today, in their life systems, is the amount of chemicals that your typical person, especially here in the US and largely, unfortunately, in the Western world, we're being exposed to a lot of endocrine disrupting chemicals. These are generally exogenous substances that we bring into our bodies that disrupt normal hormonal functioning. Now, this can be anything from pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides that are sprayed on our food in conventional agriculture that we chew up and swallow or gulp down and cause estrogenic effects to be increased. It might be personal hygiene and beauty products that we slather on our face and on our skin and on our scalp, keeping in mind that, of course, the skin is a giant mouth. Often people will be very attentive to the cleanliness, the quality of the food and drinks they swallow, but they're way less vigilant about the safety of their personal hygiene and beauty products, as though somehow we don't absorb things through the skin. In truth, what you swallow passes a number of different valuable filters to help to minimize toxicity. We help to promote detoxification and clearance of chemicals in our gut. Actually, our microbiome participates in that quite a bit if it's healthy. But then even what we absorb into the body goes through first pass hepatic clearance, where we have the opportunity to respond to at least a component of the chemicals that would be found there. But what you would slather on your skin, a portion of that goes immediately into circulation and can wreak a lot of toxic havoc before we have the opportunity to biotransform and excrete it. And if we're doing a lot of it from, say, multiple chemical products and day in and day out, the body may end up storing toxins in our tissue simply because the load of toxins outpaces our detoxification capacity. And the word detox gets thrown around a lot in progressive medical and wellness communities. But yes, the body is designed to go through multi-step biotransformation of toxic chemicals that makes them more polar and therefore able to be excreted, especially in stool, also quite a bit in the kidneys via urine, and then to much lesser degrees in things like sweat in the skin or even in our tears or exhaled through respiration. We have enzymes that are promoting all different types of biotransformation, but we can have genetic impairment in those enzymes. We can have insufficient nutrient cofactors that are need to actually synthesize those enzymes. And indeed, sometimes our toxic load is simply too much for the enzyme capacity that we have. And then we end up storing toxins in a variety of tissues. Certain toxins are preferentially stored in bone. Some are preferentially stored in the brain. A lot of toxins are preferentially stored in adipose tissue. There's some fascinating research pointing to adiposity actually being a form of depot storage for toxins. And I'm sure many of you are quite savvy and familiar with the notion of obesogenic chemicals that are promoting the buildup and the maintenance of adiposity. And the presence of these toxins can actually promote potentially the synthesis of more and more cortisol from that adipose tissue, and actually can promote greater synthesis of estrogen from that adipose tissue as well. Yes, body fat is endocrine tissue and it's making hormones. Unfortunately, a lot of those hormones are about maintaining that fat. Remember, again, that from your body's evolutionary perspective, having a certain degree of adiposity is metabolic security in the face of macronutrient uncertainty. It promotes survival. And especially if our lives are very stressful, then the body is really interested in maintaining that adiposity. But we need to be aware of and learn about endocrine disrupting chemicals, because even if a woman's levels of endogenous estrogen, both synthesis of and maybe metabolism of estrogen, they all may be optimal. not even just normal, but they may be optimal. But endocrine disrupting chemicals can make estrogen receptors more sensitive. Endocrine disrupting chemicals can prolong the attachment of a chemical in an estrogen receptor, making them more sticky, if you will. Endocrine disrupting chemicals can modify the behavior of the enzymes that metabolize these chemicals. They can actually modify the behavior of the enzymes that normally metabolize human estrogens. And in this way, the chemicals we bring into our body are mucking with and promoting estrogen imbalance with regard to our human estrogens, creating an imbalance that wasn't there before that toxicity. And so doing an inventory of personal hygiene and beauty products, learning richly where these endocrine disrupting chemicals lie and helping your patients to identify them and to replace them with non-toxic alternatives is an essential part of addressing a common root cause of obesity, because estrogen is proliferative. Absolutely higher levels of estrogen, and by that I mean estrogenic effects, which again is not just about innate estrogens, will indeed promote adiposity. It can also promote, as we know, other types of tissue growth in the body, but in particular, increases in adiposity. Unfortunately, if you test people's estrogen levels, whether it's in serum or the metabolites in urine or any other type of form, you're not seeing endocrine disrupting chemicals. You're just seeing various forms of human estrogens and their normal downstream metabolites. Hydroxyestrogens, methoxyestrogens, sulfated estrogens, right? It's not showing us those endocrine disrupting effects. And this is where we have to turn to the qualitative presentation and really looking for the puzzle pieces in this unique client's life system, their overall experience, their symptoms. Does it paint a picture of estrogen dominance? And looking for endocrine disrupting chemicals, also looking for cofactor nutrients that are needed to promote both chemical as well as innate estrogen metabolism. In general, we need to methylate really well in order to metabolize estrogens more safely and promoting less estrogenic metabolites that are less harmful. It's a good reminder that even as the body degrades hormones, those hormone metabolites still have endocrine effects. And coming back to the gut, we need to be able to excrete those hormone metabolites. But if you're constipated or you have dysmotility, maybe because of hypothyroidism, maybe because of innate gut imbalances, right? Going back to the first couple of imbalances I mentioned, then we may not clear those estrogen metabolites really well. And anytime we have dysmotility and sluggish movement of chyme through the GI tract, we increase the likelihood that we're going to reabsorb some of the very toxic substances or the waste products that the body has already modified with the intent to excrete them. We can absorb them and promote what I call retoxification. This is why one of the most important things that people can do to promote healthy metabolism is to not be constipated and also to be very well hydrated, not just with water, but also with electrolyte sufficiency so that the kidneys are healthy, so that our stools are hydrated and we have easy motility and movement of toxins out of the body in the stool. We want to sweat well and regularly to promote that excretion. But we want to be thinking about estrogen dominance. Where are women in particular, although men can also struggle with estrogen dominance, especially when they have increased belly fat, because again, adipose tissue is endocrine tissue, and not only is it making more cortisol locally, but it's also making estrogen. Men can have estrogen dominance as well, but looking for presentation in particular with exaggerated menstrual bleeding, maybe particularly debilitating PMS symptoms, perhaps migraines, maybe just hormonal monthly migraines, or maybe chronic migraines. Women may struggle with histamine overload and nasal respiratory congestion. Maybe they have frequent diarrhea or bloating, dysmotility in the gut. Maybe they worry a lot. They struggle with anxiety and hypervigilance. They have a hard time going to sleep at night. These can actually all be signs and symptoms of histamine overload. And in the body, estrogen promotes more histamine, and histamine overload promotes higher levels of estrogen. And it can be this vicious cycle of imbalance in the body. So that's the third functional imbalance that is often promoting overweight and obesity. And you can see as I'm going through these 4 common drivers, and please stay with me because I'm about to get to the 4th one. It's the most important one. We want to get at the roots of these because when we address the functional imbalance that is promoting increased adiposity, and we reverse that dynamic, not just treat it, not just put a Band-Aid on it, not restrain it artificially, but step by step in savvy clinical partnership, we work with a unique patient to actually address, resolve the roots of the imbalance in their unique body and their unique life system. Then the body will naturally lose weight. And the best part is it's sustainable because we've actually made the reason for the overweight go away. And this is not a magic pill for sure, but it is a super powerful way that people can take back control and actually have some empowerment with regard to their future health. So often medically, clinically, we're recommending these diets, these interventions that are abnormal. There are things that people are only planning to do for a little time. I'm going to do this abnormal thing for a period of time with the full intent of stopping because it's not normal to me. It's not convenient. It's not natural. I don't like it. It doesn't fit into my life. I'm inconveniencing my family. I'm standing out. I look weird. All of these reasons that are easy to avoid, but they are common reasons why people don't sustain health promoting habits. Right? Ultimately, when so much of what is normal in our societies, in our cultures, promotes disease, promotes overweight and obesity, then people have to be willing to be a healthy deviant to some degree. They got to be willing to make abnormal lifestyle choices in pursuit of abnormally healthy life experiences. And part of your clinical responsibility is helping them to find the step-by-step tools that they need in order to make that lifestyle change. If you decide that you put up a clinical barrier where all you're doing is giving out wisdom, you're prescribing medicines, you're prescribing supplements, you're giving instructions, you're giving out handy-dandy charts and instructions that you expect people to comply with, and you're dropping them off with the curb, you're not going to be a ragingly successful practitioner because people need more than that. Chronic inflammatory disease is almost always lifestyle mediated, and we can't go into people's lives and live their lives for them. But we also have to accept that interventions, these types of artificial or abnormal interventions, are not going to give people resilient relief from their chronic disease, because in order to earn that, people have to change their lives. And the vast, vast, vast majority of people cannot do that alone. They need a savvy clinical partnership with you. And they don't need you to do it for them, but they do need tools and resources from you. They need your help to set attainable goals. They need accountability and celebration. They need appropriate follow-up. These are all essential components of the art of clinical practice in functional medicine. And there's expertise here that is so often overlooked and not offered in functional medicine education. And we have many courses about it at SAFM because it's so essential. And when you learn to do that well so that your patients get amazing breakthrough results and you create raving fans and they can't stop talking about how amazing you are and how incredible it is to work with you. And oh, by the way, they keep working with you. They want to stay in that partnership. Of course they do, because it works. They want to keep doing that month after year because they finally found a partner. They finally found a place where they can be themselves and get the support that they need to be healthier. They, of course, are a raving fan, and they will tell everyone they know about you, and they will give you incredibly positive and heartfelt, authentic testimonials. You want this to build your practice and let it do a lot of your marketing for you. But I want to tell you about the fourth imbalance. We've talked about insulin resistance. We talked about hypothyroidism, especially subclinical. And we talked about estrogen dominance. But I want to talk now about sympathetic dominance. And I want to speak about the actual physiological and biochemical imbalances that are promoted by stress. At least here in the US, stress, I think, is the worst example of disease-promoting dynamics that we don't even respect. In fact, we talk about stress, we acknowledge it's bad, but then we celebrate when people make stressful choices. We celebrate people who burn the candle at both ends and achieve amazing things and are always available. People who are willing to help out all the time at the last minute. People who suppress their own needs. You can sit in a cafe anywhere in America and listen to two women almost competing for who is the better person, who is the bigger martyr or the more honorable friend, because they just keep putting more and more and more on their shoulders in the name of being of service, in the name of doing everything for everyone, right? As people pleasers. They're not necessarily taking care of themselves and their needs at all, but in their minds, that's okay because self-sacrifice in the name of being honored by or loved by everyone else is worth it. And this is a mindset, a disease-promoting mindset that is rampant in our society. Women struggle with it in a multifactorial way, and they tend to talk about it, so it's more open. Men can struggle with this in very silent, debilitating ways, especially with cultural norms that are about it's not okay for men to be weak. It's not okay for them to feel overloaded or exhausted or need a break or need help. We see these things as unmasculine or unreliable, and men are supposed to be quiet and resilient and have everlasting strength and the ability to just keep delivering, just keep providing, just keep protecting, and to still have bandwidth and room to support their spouse, support their children. And a lot of this is happening in silence. But men and women in general, especially in the US, can bring on board way too much. More. It's never enough. More money, more achievements, more accolades, more promotions, more. More acquisitions, a bigger house, a better car, a bigger insurance policy, more investments, more savings. It's never enough. And this can promote tremendous stress in our lives. But today in particular, I want to talk about physiological stress, because mental emotional stress, for sure, you need to go there in your practice. For every one of you, regardless of your modality, I believe that this is within scope for you. This is not the type of thing that we need to insist on referring out. A person who's just dealing with lots of stress and needs to be able to talk about it in terms of their overall life system and what they feel is promoting disease, they often don't need a psychologist. They certainly might not need a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist, right? They're just a normal person who is trying to present a view of the variables in their life. Want to talk about my diet, want to talk about my movement, talk about my sleep, my relationships, my medications, my supplements, my medical history, and yes, my mindfulness or relaxation activities, the status of my relationships, my belief system, my self-talk. These are all critical variables in the overall life system that is either promoting health or promoting disease. But physiological stress is something we often ignore. And if the body feels that there is a notable source of stress, regardless of the type and the source, then the body is going to promote more adiposity in the name of survival. And it does this in promoting greater levels of stress hormones. This in particular can be because of higher levels of cortisol. And that cortisol is purposefully increasing blood sugar and also blood pressure, often pulse. It's making us sleep not as well. We're more hypervigilant and ruminating and worrying. All of these things we see as annoying. But again, from the body's wisdom, this is about survival. If you are threatened, the body is not interested in you sleeping deeply. It's not interested in you reproducing. It's not interested in you focusing on detoxification. It's not really interested in promoting good digestion or gut function either, because all it wants to do is survive for the next day or so. And for a long time, human survival was threatened in potentially calamitous ways on a regular basis. And so we became very good at having a strong sympathetic state and a strong parasympathetic state. The first is to promote survival. The second is to promote thriving. A lot of people in your practice are making choices and living their lives, knowingly or unknowingly, that are promoting a sympathetic state. It's all about fight, flight, and hide. And that's okay if it's for a short period of time, a particularly stressful day, a rough week, a really challenging month. But when it becomes chronic, when it becomes a way of life, then the body's physiology and biochemistry is promoting fighting, flighting, and hiding. But that is going on month after month, year after year at a time when the patient wants to be having a parasympathetic life experience. This person wants to be thin and have easy bowel movements and beautiful skin and eat anything they want to and fall asleep at the drop of a hat and have awesome libido and good, robust orgasms and get pregnant when they want to. They want to be having this high vitality, rest, digest, heal, make babies that are artifacts of a parasympathetic dominant set of choices. But too often people are making sympathetic promoting choices and behaviors, but expecting a parasympathetic experience. And that's not going to happen. That's impossible. That would have never promoted the evolution of the human organism. And so there's a critical part of education here. But sometimes people's cortisol levels are ramping up, or they have frequent surges of even adrenaline, norepinephrine, epinephrine, because of physiological stressors. And so things like sleep apnea. Many times we think about sleep apnea, especially in its early stages, as being more annoying. Certainly your patients are more likely to think about sleep apnea as being an advanced form of snoring, mostly just pesky and irritating in the way of a good night's sleep. But night after night after night, the body's innate wisdom, your nervous system, knows that you almost died. You did not get proper oxygenation. And in fact, that happened often enough during the night that the body purposefully popped you with a surge of adrenaline to make you gasp for air in order to promote oxygenation to critical tissues. This over time is a massive source of stress to the body, and why we want to do not just a superficial but a deep inventory of sleep behavior and sleep artifacts for every single person you're working with. Even if they on the surface say, no, I think I sleep well. I'm fine, right? The other F word. We want to do a deeper investigation, because sometimes people don't know that they snore. They don't know they have sleep apnea until they actually go and ask their sleep partner, tell me what you experienced about me in the middle of the night. I'm amazed at the number of people where their spouse will look at them and say, seriously, is that a question? Because, you move all night long. I think you have this thing called restless leg, like you're flailing around, like you're having some kind of gymnastic routine in your dreams. But the other person might be shocked. Really? You never told me that. I didn't know that. So we don't learn what we don't ask about, right? We can't discover what we don't assess. And so food allergies and sensitivities can be a major reason that people get strange blood sugar spikes on the other side of a snack or a meal that is not reflective of the macronutrient glycemic load of that food. Well, this can be because, as far as the body's concerned, that food is a stressor. That food is a threat. It might be because it's a known allergen. It might be because it is maldigested and looks a little too much like a known threat, a microbial known threat, and the body has either an IgA or an IgG mediated hypersensitivity to it. Sometimes foods, even what we think of as low glycemic foods, can cause a higher glycemic load because of immune hypervigilance against them. This is one of the really powerful things you can learn by using a continuous glucose monitor, even with your patients who don't have overt metabolic disease, but who simply have overweight or obesity, or even nominal weight, but you can see that hemoglobin A1C or that fasting insulin or fasting C-peptide trending up. We also want to think about toxicity. The immune system can have strong aggressive responses to toxins because, of course, the body knows these are exogenous chemicals. And even separate from an immune system response, from an antibody viewpoint, we can still end up with a pro-inflammatory innate immune system response to toxins, for example. Histamine overload, right? A high histamine diet that comes into the body with an impaired ability to degrade histamine. Histamine is a pro-inflammatory mediator. It promotes hypervigilance, and it is going to trigger higher levels of stress hormones. So histamine overload, whether it's the histamine itself that we're bringing into the body from our diet, or maybe the histamine that's being produced by our microbiome in our gut. Regardless of the source, that can also be a reason for physiological stress. Impaired sleep is another reason why you might have next morning elevated levels in stress hormones. In fact, you can see that happen even after the first night or two of either insufficient duration of sleep, or even more insidiously, the people who perceive that they sleep 7.5, 8 hours, but behind the scenes, it's light sleep, or it is sleep that is not allowing sufficient cycles of either REM or deep sleep. And this can also be present when people are taking sleep medications like Ambien or various benzodiazepines, for example. We perceive that we're asleep for a period of time, but our sleep architecture is impaired by the artificial component of the medications. So we want to do a deep dive into stress and not limit ourselves to job stress, emotional stress, mental stress, social stress, but look for those physiological stressors because they are often overlooked. So we talked about 4 common functional imbalances that are at the roots of overweight and obesity. And you too can learn to master all of these, not only from a knowledge of the physiology and biochemistry, but also from the science and the art of clinical practice. So you can turn knowledge into actual capability and confidence, and not only maximize your patients' and clients' results, their durable health, but most importantly, you can earn for yourself as a practitioner that deep, abiding sense of satisfaction and fulfillment that you crave, and as a passionate, heart-centered practitioner, you richly deserve. Thank you so much for joining me. If you loved today's session, please hit subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you next time.